Hello, I'm Jordan Dahl, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. Today, we're talking about unconventional career paths. We tend to think the road to success or our dream job is a straight path, but my next guest is proof that the trajectory is unique to every individual, like going from actor to White House staff. We're joined today by Kal Penn, producer, actor, and writer. Most recently, he's the author of the memoir You Can't Be Serious. You may also know him as host of the Food Network's Money Hungry or the comedy Harold and Kumar. He also served as Associate Director of the White House Office of Public Engagement. Kal, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks for having me.
Thrilled to have you here. What struck me most in your memoir is your conviction that you could be both an actor and working in public service. And you even went so far as to tell your high school counselor, who did their best to dissuade you, obviously to no avail. And I'm wondering, as you got further into your career, how real did that feel as a possibility that you could do both?
That's a great question, and thanks for shouting out what I call in the book some of the worst advice I've ever gotten, which was from my high school guidance counselor, who I think is now dead. But I'm kidding. She's very much alive. That was a joke. But I remember this. I was 16 or 17 years old, and I said to her, I'd love to be a professional artist. I want to go to film school. I want to go to drama school, and then at some point in my career, I'd also like to mix it up and add a little bit of public service. And she sort of looked at me and said, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And sort of left it at that. And I realize now as an adult, what she maybe, hopefully, was trying to say was those are two really difficult career paths to navigate, and you might want to sort of have a plan before you leave high school. But I don't think the goal was to ever necessarily do them at the exact same time. There were two dueling passions of mine, as I know plenty of people who are watching today can relate to. You don't view the world as binary. You don't necessarily view your choices as mutually exclusive. So it wasn't a question of, well, I want to direct or produce movies in the next year, and also I'm going to one day work at, in the highest levels of government. It was more of the passion that was behind that and the hope that I could navigate that path somehow.
You did end up fulfilling both of those, working in the highest levels of government at the White House. Give viewers a little bit of a rundown about how you got involved with the Obama campaign.
Yeah, so the story of how I ended up working at the White House is actually not that different from thousands of other people who work in government, not just in the executive branch, but sort of all over. In the sense that, so I was a political appointee. I had joined President Obama's campaign back in October of 2007. So he had just come out of a summer slump. He was down 30 points against Hillary Clinton and John Edwards in a very crowded Democratic primary. And I signed up to volunteer. I was going to do, I think it was 3 days in Des Moines before the Iowa caucuses. And I ended up really falling in love with a lot of people on his campaign staff, the work ethic, the things that they were pushing for that really aligned with my views and my beliefs. And I ended up staying through the caucuses, which he surprisingly won, and then went to 26 other states over the course of the next year and a half on behalf of his campaign. And I was working on the Arts Policy Committee. I was working on arts education and cultural diplomacy and youth outreach and Asian American outreach. And what a lot of people don't realize, and I totally understand in retrospect, especially now, when you started a small political campaign, and certainly this goes for somebody who's running for president, but really on the local and state level too, if you start early enough, you're really trusted to do sort of the real work on the ground, and you're working with the candidate, you're getting to know the candidate's family, the senior advisors. So by the time, in our case, that the circles grew larger and larger, we were trusted with quite a bit in terms of organizing and outreach, which is one of the things that led to the chance to work in government.
Yeah, it's a great point of how different it can be on the campaign trail versus what people might envision that it actually looks like. I want to say hello to some of the members who are joining us today. Marlena's from North Carolina, Clara from Texas, Melody is joining us all the way from Portugal. And Hijal says, got your new book. Can't wait to read it. And thank you for being a trailblazer in the South Asian community. And, I actually want to touch upon that because in your book, you write a lot about your family, your upbringing, and you write, I understood our parents' struggles, their immigration experience, the ways in which it was impossible for their generation to divorce culture from profession. What did it mean for you then to go into acting, to go into entertainment, and to step away from that mold and sort of those expectations?
Sure, and thanks for that very kind comment. I appreciate it. So that section of the quote is actually referring to both our parents' generation and the kind of hopes and dreams that they had for their kids, as well as my generation of South Asians specifically, but I would say Asian Americans as a whole. So I'm of the generation where, our parents were allowed to come to the United States post 1965. There was a change in immigration law that allowed people from Asian countries, especially, to come if they were pursuing careers in medicine or engineering. And that's because we didn't have enough American-born engineers or doctors. So my dad came to pursue a graduate degree in engineering. My mom had a graduate degree in chemistry. Must have been inconceivable that I'm born and can barely do math. And I did understand from their perspective, when the thing that allows you to come to America in search of the American dream is that sort of stability. It puts a roof over your head. You're pursuing a really well-heeled path. Anybody who strays from that, for any parent, frankly, has got to be pretty scary. The thing that I touch on in that book, which I think also applies to the very kind comment that you just read, is that I was also feeling pressure from my own peers. So there were people within the South Asian community, especially when I was an undergrad at UCLA, who would sort of look down upon anyone who was in the community and was pursuing something outside of the fields that our parents were pursuing. And that's something that I had never been able to wrap my head around. I understood, of course, the parents' generation wanting what's best for their kids through what they really knew. But it seemed strange that next generation was also feeling that pressure. Now, look, 20 years later, I'm so glad that that's changed. And I'm so glad that from everything from the creative side to the business side, people have been pursuing all sorts of things that they find interesting and compelling in life. But it was definitely tough. I'm sure, for people who I've spoken to who don't have the same background that I have, it seems like everyone can relate to that, whether it was an auntie or an uncle or a family member or someone in your community who's sort of saying, you shouldn't do this thing that you really want to do, only to find out later that it was maybe fear that drove them to say that, or it was a doubt in themselves that they were projecting on you. I think those are all totally valid things to work through, and it's always interesting for me to hear other people's experiences with that as well.
Absolutely, of people's expectations being put on you, no matter your community or kind of where you come from. One thing that I found many things interesting, but you write unflinchingly about the racism that you encountered and that you continue to encounter in the entertainment industry. But one quote that stood out to me is about how you handle these interactions. And you write that I couldn't afford to waste time and energy being upset with racist casting directors or bigoted producers. This didn't mean I was suddenly not angry when I encountered them. As much as I still wanted to scream and kick them in the throat, their BS didn't deserve all my energy. How were you able to get to that point of not allowing that to detract from what you were doing and not give it energy, but still deal emotionally with some of the things that would come up? I'm sure there's a lot of people watching who could relate to that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for picking the positive quote from that section, because there were, I think it was about 30 or 40 pages before that moment in the book where I really outline what those experiences were like, dealing with especially early racism in my career, walking into meetings, being asked why I speak such good English. I was like, I grew up in New Jersey. Why is your English so bad? Not being told by casting directors, where's your turban? Can you go home and put a bed sheet on your head? And I remember explaining that I'm not sick, so I don't have a turban, and the bed sheet thing obviously is absurd. And it got to a point where this would happen over and over again over the course of a couple of years. And there were two things that I remember about that quote that you just read. One, there was this weird self-fulfillment of defeat that I would experience. So I was only getting auditions for parts that were written specifically for brown actors or Indian American roles. And those roles were overwhelmingly stereotypical. That meant that they were small roles, they were specific professions, they wanted an accent. And to be very clear, none of those things form a stereotype. Plenty of people have accents. It's that Hollywood's version of an accent tends to be reductionist, right? It's never about what that person does or who that person is. It's always about those externalities. And that got very frustrating. So on the rare occasion when I would be allowed to audition for, the part of a dude named Dave from Des Moines or something, I was so in my head about the fact that I knew I wasn't going to get that part. Because I knew that some other actor who looked a lot more mainstream was going to beat me out of it. And there was a moment when I just kind of thought, why am I doing this? If I'm beating myself up so much, and if I'm hating going out on these auditions and these job interviews, I should just stop, because I don't love it enough. And of course, I didn't stop, because if there's one thing you know about any of your friends who are artists, we're all insane. Whether you're a musician or a dancer, or a painter, an actor, whatever, there's a part of you that needs to do your art. And I think that's one of the big differences between somebody who has the privilege of pursuing it as a hobby, which I will always envy, and someone who feels the need to pursue it as a career. And the other reason that I mentioned that quote in the context of all those chapters is it echoed some of the really good advice that I got when I was in college that I took to heart at the time and then really lost sight of. So there was an event that I went to with, I believe this was a conversation with the only Black woman on network TV at the time, or the only Black actor, period, on network TV at the time. And somebody had asked her in this conversation, how do you deal with rejection? And how do you deal with the fact that you because of the color of your skin, you're not going to get certain jobs, you're not going to get certain parts. And she said, I just come prepared. I'm a classically trained actor. I've studied Shakespeare. I've done all the classics. I know that I'm more qualified when I walk into that audition room than 90% of other people who are coming in there. And if those producers still want to hire, the person who they think looks more palatable, I know that they know that she's not going to have the training and the credits that I have for the most part. And I really took that to heart, because I thought, what an interesting way of taking your energy and putting it towards something that you actually can do. This woman was standing on stage saying that she understood that she's going to have to work 1,000 times harder than somebody else just to get their foot in the door. And I was sick of feeling burdened by that. I was sick of being angry about it all the time. I would rather use that energy and put it towards working 1,000 times harder, knowing that that was the reality of the marketplace at the time. And the reason I tell all those stories in the book is I'm so thankful how much things have changed, but I'm also mindful of how far things have yet to go.
Let's say hello to some more people who are joining us. We have Kane from Indiana, Susan from Chicago, and Shazia all the way from Indonesia. Quite the global crowd joining us today. Lavanya asks, how did you overcome different hurdles to reach where you are in your career?
I always struggle with how to answer a question like this, because I never view it as a destination, in a sense that they're always going to be as, the two industries I've had the privilege of working in are two industries I love very deeply. So I really love storytelling. I love what I do as an actor. And that's probably the reason that I decided to stick with it so much, is it really brings me joy, and especially seeing how much the industry's changed over the years. It's something that excites me. The public service space is similar in a sense, where the point of saying all this is both of those industries, we kind of view them as monoliths. We tend to view them as totally unmalleable. And the reality is they're far from that, right? But it takes a really long time to influence how those things change and develop. So I think one of the things that I did was try to enjoy the small victories, and keep in mind that in my case, especially as an artist, it was less about attaining something 5 or 10 years down the line, and much more about the journey of getting there. So feeling like those audition stories that I mentioned to you, of which there's 50 pages of them in this book, through all of that, it was still wanting to feel happy when I was actually able to book a job, wanting to experience what it was like to make that art, to tell those stories, to make audiences laugh or cry, which was the ultimate goal of what I wanted to do anyway. So I think focusing on the fact that that's what I knew that I wanted, and finding opportunities for myself was a big change. And I would, it wouldn't be appropriate to answer that question without also just talking about how much technology has changed in that space, right? There are so many content creators now who don't need to rely on the system the way that I maybe had to, or the people who even came certainly well before me had to. They can pick up their phones, they can edit something, they can put a creative piece together, whether you're an actor, whether you're in the corporate world, and kind of test things out in a way that makes you a little more confident in what you're doing. So in that sense, I'm just in awe at how technology has made things a lot easier and more accessible.
I love that part about focusing on the journey and not just the destination. This is something that I think a lot of our viewers can relate to. We're going through this moment where people are shifting jobs, or shifting industries, discovering what they really want to do in their careers. And I'm wondering, what did you learn in Hollywood that you were able to bring with you and make an asset in the Obama administration? And were there things that you took away from your time in public service that made you a better actor?
Yeah, the second question, definitely. The first question, actually, not as much. So I viewed these two worlds as totally different, and part of the reason was I was mindful of the fact that, look, I'm coming from a career in entertainment as an actor. I just want to put my head down and do really good work. I never want to be seen as somebody who thought that he could get a government job because he worked on TV before. And my boss, Valerie Jarrett, when I sat down for my job interview with her, I needed to know the answer to that question. So I asked her, and I said, I just want to make sure I'm not being hired because I was an actor. Or am an actor. And she said, she smiled at me and she said, I can assure you, you're being hired in spite of that. And I just thought, ouch, but also awesome. And so I kind of checked I knew the sabbatical that I was going to take from acting would be a year or two. So I kind of checked all of that at the door and went to go work in the administration. There are 2 or 3 times when I had to kind of tap into my knowledge or relationships in the entertainment industry to be helpful in my White House work. But with those exceptions, and those exceptions were actually big ones on things like the response to the earthquake in Haiti and a few other items like that. But besides that, the two were kind of divorced. Now, on the flip side, I actually thought that working in government might make me a worse actor. And the reason for that is that when I worked in the outreach office at the White House, and one of the big rules that the communications team had for us, and I'm sure those of you who work in the corporate world can relate to this, they were terrified if we would stray from talking points. And the reason they were terrified was because they didn't want us to say anything that would make news. The newsmaking should be done by the principals. It should be done by the president or cabinet secretaries or senior advisors. It shouldn't be done by a junior or mid-level staffer like me in an office like the outreach office. The downside to that was if your whole job is to do outreach towards young Americans or a certain demographic group, you're making a speech. You should be funny. You should be likable. You should be charming. Those are all things that are part of my skill set as an actor, especially in improvisation. And I wasn't allowed to do any of it. So I was terrified that at the end of my 2 years, I just didn't have it in me anymore, that maybe it would affect my improv skills, maybe it would affect something else. Instead, the flip side happened. And when I did return to acting, I was, first of all, very thankful that audiences were letting me back into their homes. But the second thing was it taught me a lot of patience. So government moves very slowly. Obviously, you don't have to look far on Twitter to see how much people malign government being so slow, no matter what your political beliefs are. That's largely true because that's how government's set up. But coming back to something like entertainment, where there are also strong personalities and people who are very passionate about what they do, having that perspective of patience, I think, made things a little better for me in terms of going back into an industry that I was equally passionate about. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does, definitely.
Okay.
I do want to touch back on something that you said in the beginning of your answer about Valerie Jarrett and going to her and making sure that fame was not why you were given the job. And you made a point of talking about this, of ensuring that you were based on your skills, your qualifications. You went so far as to applying for a job on change.org or change.gov instead of actually talking to someone. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about threading that needle of knowing when to rely on your connections and those experiences that you have versus letting process and tradition run its course.
Sure. So, I guess I'll share this with you because it was probably what not to do. And so what I know now about what I would do differently. So, as I mentioned, I started working on the Obama campaign back in 2007. So most folks didn't think that then Senator Obama was a viable candidate. A lot of people couldn't pronounce his name yet. Everybody certainly thought he gives great speeches, but he's never going to win a primary state. And so when you start at that point, you're really doing a lot of the grassroots work. You're doing real heavy lifting. And as I mentioned, as the campaign grows, you're trusted with more and more to do. So when the campaign had ended then, and I had been to more than half the country doing various jobs, I applied because the campaign sent out an email that said, if you'd like to work for the administration, upload your resume to change.gov. And I thought, okay, well, I'll just do that. And I'm not going to tell anybody that I applied because I don't want to make it seem like I'm asking for a favor. Because I love what I do as an actor. I mean, I so genuinely, I was on the TV show House at the time. I'd worked really hard to finally get a regular job on television, which is incredibly coveted for any actor, but especially a performer of color. But then I also thought, well, I just spent a year and a half telling other people what they should do. If there is an opportunity, if I really am qualified to work in the incoming administration, it's something that I'd love to take a sabbatical from my acting career to do. So I fill out this application. I submit my resume. The only person I told was my manager, my acting manager, who in the book I describe, and this is pretty accurate, I describe him as every character from the TV show Entourage in one person, which means he's a ridiculous human being who's like a lion with a heart of gold. I told him, and that was it. And nobody called, obviously. Nobody thought. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm not qualified if nobody called me. Then a few more months go by, and I was asked to be part of the Obama inaugural concert at the Lincoln Memorial. And one of the perks of being part of that concert is you get to bring your family and friends backstage to meet the incoming first family. And in a very small sort of in passing backstage, Mrs. Obama says to me, "I hope you continue to stay involved." And I thought, this is something she says to everybody. Of course, I'd love to stay involved. And my manager, the one who's like Entourage, says, "Well, you know, Kal applied for a job, right?" And I said, "Oh, no, don't. This is not the time and place to say something like that." And Mrs. Obama says, "What do you mean?" And he goes, he applied for a job and nobody even called him back. And I was just like, dude, please don't do this. This is embarrassing. Mrs. Obama then looks at me and says, "Who did you apply with?" And it just came out of my mouth. I said, "Well, I put my resume on change.gov. And as soon as those words came out of my mouth, I realized how ridiculous they must sound. And she sort of looked at me as if I had dropped a piece of pizza on the floor and picked it up and ate it after the 5-second rule. She called the president-elect over. You know, she said, "Tell him what you just told me." And I was like, oh my gosh, these guys are hazing me into telling them how I applied for this job online. And I did mention it to him. And he was a little bit more sort of gave me the look of, are you really that naive? And in telling the story now, look, in 2021, and obviously writing about it in a book in a much more ridiculous way that I'm telling you right now, it's funny to look back in that self-deprecating way. But in the moment, the thing that I realized was actually not about the fact that, yes, they're the incoming first family, and of course that's a big deal, and it's an honor to serve your country. It was much smaller than that. It was that if you had worked for any campaign or company that started out 30 points down, and then you had the privilege of being with that company for this big ascend, and you wanted to continue working for them, you should let your boss know, because you might be considered a valuable member of a team. And by not letting it be known that you might want to continue working for that entity in their growth and after that growth, it almost seems disrespectful. And that's not something I had ever considered, because part of it, look, was maybe a feeling of imposter syndrome and do I really belong here? Part of it was a feeling of being really proud of the work that I'd done, but not wanting to rock the boat. And part of it was also, as I'm sure a lot of you can relate to, I mean, you know, the guy who's got 18 things on his email signature line is never the hardest worker. And I just didn't want to be that person either. And so in getting hazed by Mrs. Obama and that leading to a formal interview and an opportunity to see if there was something I was actually qualified at, that really struck me. I said, you know, I need to check myself a little bit differently. I'm coming from a performing arts world where you have an agent or a manager or somebody who has those conversations before you actually get into the room. And in the rest of the world, the real world, it's a good lesson to remember that making your voice heard and taking advantage of your networks and shooting your shot in a respectful, driven way is what I should have been doing and what I learned from that experience to do better the next time around.
I think I speak for all viewers when I say I wish there was a video of this, of just seeing that look of incredulity on Mrs. Obama.
Well, you know, the thing that everybody knows now, of course, is like, you know, that Mrs. Obama has a very low threshold for BS. And everybody in the world knows what that face looks like when she faces that BS. So that was the look that I was given.
On the receiving end of it.
Exactly.
So what advice might you have for people who are just starting out in their careers? We have a lot of younger professionals on the platform who are joining in. What do you have to say to them about jumpstarting their career, whether it's in entertainment, public service?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's such a wonderful time to start a new career in ways that, and I know people might be rolling your eyes, like, what are you talking about? We're still in a pandemic. What I mean by that is that it just seems to me, like in the last 15 years, corporate culture and opportunity has changed so dramatically. And in some ways, you know, it's changed for the better, I think, in terms of barriers to entry having fallen. I guess one of the things that I'm really glad that I did, you know, there's a whole chapter in this book about one of the worst bosses that I ever had when I was interning at a film studio. And I stuck it out for almost a year because he promised me, it was an unpaid internship. I'm so glad those are on their way out the door, it seems, in most places. But it was an unpaid internship, a full-time gig with the promise of employment after graduation. And I learned everything not to do about producing films from this guy. And by 2021 standards, he was a racist, a misogynist, just not a good producer. And I say that I detail the reasons why I focused on him being such a racist and misogynist, is that it really made the quality of his work less, and it put him at a disadvantage. Aside from the fact that it's obviously morally abhorrent, the thing that fascinated me was he was digging his own grave. I mean, the guy ended up producing one movie, and is now a real estate agent in Florida. No disrespect to real estate agents in Florida. So I learned what not to do. I think the point of telling you that story, and the point of why I write about it so much, is it was a net positive at the end of the day to keep my head down and do good work. And it was always really difficult to temper the lack of patience that I think many of us have, where I'm like, all right, I've worked here for 6 months. Where's my promotion? Or I've worked here for 8 months. What are my perks? And there is a benefit to keeping your head down and doing that work, but also the lesson learned from the how I got my White House job story that I told you was doing it in a way where you're not just a quiet cog in the wheel, but really trying to learn everything you can, even if the circumstances of the job market, and I've had several jobs that I've outlined here, even if they're not the most ideal.
You have had so many roles. Is there one that's still on your bucket list, one that you think, you really want to go out for, and that's your next shot in life?
Acting-wise or job-wise in general?
Job-wise in general. You've been an actor, producer, you create a sitcom, you've been in the White House.
Sure.
What else on the bucket list?
One of my favorite jobs that I had was the summer that I worked on a farm, just because it got me in ridiculous shape. So I'd love to do that again. But some of the more fulfilling jobs that I've had recently are when I've created and have the chance to create TV shows. There's a chapter towards the end of the book where I talk about how network television has changed and how the industry is changing in favor of streaming, which I think most of us watch our content streaming on streaming platforms to begin with, not network TV. So I'd love to create another show, this time for a streaming platform. We'd love to do a fourth Harold and Kumar film. I've made no secret of the fact that in retirement, I'd love to segue my private sector arts experience into something in the cultural diplomacy space. So again, I think like a lot of people who are probably joining today for that very reason, you don't view your career path or your life as made up of these mutually exclusive choices. And it's always nice to meet and connect with people who have that same worldview.
I want to say hello to some of the members. We have so many people joining the stream today and saying, thank you for coming on. Davina says, you have to be creative these days. Relying on a linear path can delay your progress. Gary says, great advice, Kal. As a career coach, I always encourage people to engage with people in their internships and other experiences. And Melody says, thank you for sharing with us. It's great to hear about all of your experiences.
Thank you all.
Nice. Second that. Thank you so much for coming on today, Kal. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you. And can I just say thanks to everybody who joined. Thanks for everyone who's been sliding into those DMs, who've read the book already. I really appreciate the love and support, and I'm glad so many of the stories are resonating with you. So thanks for having me on to share.
Thank you, Kal Penn, actor, producer, and author of the book, You Can't Be Serious. Thank all of you for your comments and for joining us today. You can continue the conversation or check out other stories to the right of your feed, or if you're on mobile, click into the search box. On Thursday, join us as my colleague George Anders chats with Realtor's chief economist on what home buyers and sellers can expect next year and the best ways to prepare. I'm Jordan Dahl. Thank you for watching LinkedIn News Live.